Hey, good morning, everybody. You know what time it is? It is Saturday morning, and this is Multifamily Unplugged. Welcome. Glad that you're here this morning. And if you're here for the first time, I'm really glad you're here. I hope that you will get a ton of knowledge, a ton of information, not only from today, but past episodes and what we do looking forward. Because, we're here to talk about multifamily. We're here to talk about capital raising. We're here to talk about syndicating deals. And my guest today is going to bring a lot of that value to our platform today. But before we go there, I just kind of laid out what my intention was for the show and for you. But what's your intention? Do you get up every day and blindly kind of walk in a direction where you really are just stumbling around, not knowing where you're going? Or are you getting up intentionally and following some daily disciplines? Maybe you exercise, maybe you do some yoga, maybe you meditate, maybe you find some time for prayer to get your day started. Those daily disciplines are really important for us. It's that beginning shot in the arm that gets us focused and gets us in the groove, so to say. And then what about your business? Are you intentional about what you're trying to accomplish every day? Whether you're underwriting, whether you're working on raising capital, whether you're looking for a deal, what are your intentions around that? And what are your intentions for accomplishment? So I want to bring that to the forefront because I want you to think about that. And I want you to put yourself in that position of, starting to be more intentional about what you're doing daily, because the more we grow daily, the more we grow monthly and annually, right? Hey, picture this. If you grow 1% a day personally, by the end of the year, you've grown 365%. So, when you look back and you take a look at what happened over the year, now where are you at? You're in a totally different place. And I always say none of us grow professionally till we grow personally. So glad that you're here today. Please like us, love us. If you're on YouTube this morning, subscribe to our YouTube channel. My guest this morning, Gurpreet Pada or Singh Pada with Red Pill Capital, and Capital's with a K, which is interesting. We're going to talk about that. But he's from St. Louis, Missouri. He's the co-author of Next Level, a book that has hit #1 on the bestseller. And let me bring him in. Good morning. How are you?
Excellent. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad to see you. I know that the first time we connected, we had a great conversation, and I really felt that you'd be a great guest on Multifamily Unplugged because of who you are, what you do, and what you're doing in the multifamily space. So I'm grateful that you decided to take some time this morning. So I always start my show with one question, and I always ask my guests, in one word, what best describes you personally and professionally?
So I would tell you it's two words for me, but it's really one word. It's in the concept of understanding and dealing with crisis. So I'm a crisis investor, and I'm constantly trying to figure out what are the inflection points in systems, and how do I predict what's going to happen next? So for me, it's the concept of crisis.
Crisis. Wow, that's interesting. Everybody who comes on and I ask that question, it's always a positive twist, right? So they're going to say, I'm passionate, I'm tenacious, I'm determined, I'm focused. But crisis, there's a ton of opportunity in crisis. It's like somebody told me one time, on the other side of chaos, there's always growth. And
exactly.
that always made a lot of sense to me. So how about why don't you talk about your background? What where you came from, what you do, how you got in the crazy world of multifamily and doing what you're doing today.
Yeah. So I grew up in India, and I grew up about maybe 17 years after the partition, when India and Pakistan separated, when the British left. And so this was a time when 17 years before, there had been death trains that had gone between Pakistan and India, and millions of people were killed because they were trying to return to their homeland. The British had left, and before they left, they looted the country and they took out trillions of dollars, or trillions of equivalent dollars. And so India was basically in a state of utter decimation economically. And I grew up in an area that my family was politically active. My grandfather had been the viceroy of Lahore. He was an elected official in Pakistan, but now we were living in Punjab, India. And because he had been a populist in Pakistan, and we're Sikh, and most of Pakistan was Muslim, a lot of the Muslims didn't like the fact that the Sikh guy had run the country, and he still had a lot of affinity over there. So the local clergy had declared fatwas against our family. And fatwas are basically edicts that if somebody goes and kills somebody, they're going to go to heaven faster, or they're going to get a reward. And so as a little kid, I grew up under the constant fear of being poisoned or killed. And eventually got to the point where, because I had bad ADD, I was constantly eating things I wasn't supposed to. And I had a guard dog and I had a guard, but I would constantly get myself in mischief. They essentially put me in an orphanage because they didn't want people to know who I was. And so I ended up living for a couple of years, not seeing my parents. And this was back when I was like 2 years old. So I really didn't see my parents for another 5 or 6 years. I had forgotten who they were, basically. But living in that chaotic turmoil, it really kind of allowed me to experience things in a whole different way. It was just a fascinating time for me. When we left India, and my father was a physicist, my mother's a mathematician, so I came with some decent genes, and my father was working on the neutron bomb project. My mother was a cartographer, and she was working on algorithms for connecting maps together. We came to the States, and I was able to kind of connect with people, but not in a direct way, because I looked different than everybody else. And I had grown up in the urban core of St. Louis. So I was the only kid with a turban for 100 miles. And I was brown, and everybody else was black, and I didn't speak English well. And, it worked out. I mean, I learned a lot. I got beat up a lot too. And eventually, when I got to middle school, high school, I ended up going to the county and being the only brown kid in an all-white school now. And so I never really quite fit in. I got to experience the United States as an outsider. And I had already experienced India as somebody that was dealing with turmoil. So it was a combination of things that allowed me to have a lot of insight. I had also come from India, which was experimenting with communism. And I knew that I didn't want to live in a communist world, because in a communist world, if you wanted to buy something, you had to have a lot of permissions. So if you wanted to buy a car or a scooter, you would come and you would pay your money, and you would have to give them a ticket or a chit. It was a receipt. And then 10 years later, you would come and pick it up. And so I knew that that's not the world that I wanted to live in. So I got embedded into US capitalism when I was in my teens. And I started to figure out how to make as much money as I could. And I was fascinated by it. And I did what I could, because I couldn't get hired at McDonald's, because, they didn't really hire kids that wore turbans at McDonald's. And so I ended up creating my own job. I ended up learning how to do, first I started cutting grass, and then I started fixing people's houses, and I started doing roofs. And eventually I started to hire people to work with me. And eventually I got to the point where I had enough of crews working for me that they would drop me off at high school in the morning, because I couldn't drive, but they could. And so I would answer their questions by the payphone in the high school cafeteria during lunch. And so those are kind of my beginnings. That's how I got into construction. That's how I started to understand how systems work. that's kind of how I ended up understanding what crisis is and understanding how to live at the edge of crisis. Crisis is basically when you have chaos, but there's tremendous opportunity right there. It's the edge of that.
One thing I think we might have to explain to some of our listeners this morning what a payphone is.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the thing in the high school that you at that time you had the little buttons and it would ring.
Yeah, that goes to sometimes it's funny because we say things that kind of date us, and that's one of those things. But so you basically built a construction company, and where did you go from there, education wise and business wise?
So back to my horrendous ADD. I have terrible ADD. And fortunately or unfortunately, I didn't have a lot of parental supervision when I was young. And so I was able to kind of channel my ADD however I wanted it to. And as long as I can be successful at whatever I'm doing, it was okay. So I loved construction. I loved computers. And I loved science. And so I ended up going into medical school. And I went into a 6-year med program. I was the youngest kid admitted to a 6-year medical program. I started medical school when I was 17. And I graduated, I think, 6 years later when I was 22, 23. And I'm an adrenaline junkie. And so I wanted to do something with a lot of adrenaline. And I ended up doing surgery at Cook County Hospital in Chicago because I loved the concept of that fast movement and all of the things associated with it. So I ended up that way. But at the same time, like I said, I have ADD. So I kept investing in multifamily investing. I kept buying buildings. That's how I got through medical school. That's how I paid for it. I would buy and sell and flip. And I just didn't know it was called flipping. I just knew that I would buy something cheap. I'd fix it up a little bit and I'd sell it.
Yeah.
Or I'd buy something.
Hang on one second. So I want people to get this. I want people to understand this point and don't want to just breeze over this. But you put yourself through medical school flipping small multifamily properties.
I flipped everything I could. But yeah, I flipped small multifamily. But sometimes I would flip a warehouse. Sometimes I would flip a multifamily. Sometimes I would flip. I would look basically, I'm an opportunist. And so I would look at all of the auctions that were upcoming. I'll give you an example that's kind of seems strange, but there was an opportunity. I ran across an auction that was in the middle of winter in Kansas City. And I realized that there was a snowstorm that day. I'm like, I bet you nobody's going to be there. And I ended up buying a warehouse. And I'd never been in the warehouse. It was a bonded warehouse. And I got a couple of people to give me some money because I needed about 10,000 and I had about 2. And so I got 4 or 5 people to collaborate with me. We put about 10 grand together. We went to the warehouse auction thinking there's no way we're going to get this because it's a giant warehouse, but we were the only ones there. And so we ended up getting it at the opening bid of 10K. And when we finally got into it the next day, it broke the locks, got in, realized that it was filled from floor to ceiling with waterbeds. And all of a sudden now we were in the waterbed business. So that spring we spent with U-Haul trucks traveling all over the Midwest with U-Haul trucks filled with waterbeds, selling them at gas stations. And then we ended up selling the property and we ended up selling the land. So we tried to make the best out of whatever we had. We made a lot of money. I mean, it paid for my entire tuition that semester.
Wow.
And I wouldn't call it syndication because that would be improper, but that's what we basically did is we all collaborated together and we pooled our money and bought this.
Well, that's kind of a joint venture type deal. When you have a couple people and, you don't have the SEC filings and that it really becomes more of a joint venture type opportunity, right?
Yeah, it is exactly what it was because there was and we all worked for it. I mean, we all hustled, we all went out and sold, and I went up to Chicago with a truck of waterbeds.
See, this fascinates me though. I mean, how could somebody, and obviously if it's filled with water beds, it had to be a supplier or a waterbed retailer that just abandoned all that stuff.
It was a waterbed company out of Canada, we found out when we got in there and saw the paperwork that was sitting around. And they had gone out of business in Canada, and they had not paid their issues in Kansas City. They hadn't paid their mortgages. And so it was a bonded, secured warehouse, and everything was locked up. Nobody had gotten into it.
Wow.
And so we ended up making some decent cash.
It's kind of like, you ever watch Storage Wars?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's kind of like Storage Wars. Wow, you open up and
you don't know what you're going to get.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Boy, that's a fascinating story, though. So go ahead. What was the next step?
Well, so meanwhile, here I am doing surgery at Cook County, and I got a little bored because I liked surgery, but it wasn't thoughtful enough. I liked the mental models of things. So I went into anesthesia, and then I went into pediatric anesthesia. Then I went into interventional pain. And then, 20, 30 years later, I'm running an interventional pain shop in St. Louis City. And all the while, I've been steadily investing in commercial real estate. So we're at the point now, I've been doing this I'm 58 now. I've been doing this since my first property I bought when I was like 16, 17. I've been doing this a long time, and, I love it because if the mental model for me is to identify things that other people don't see. So, for example, I just did a deal. I've done 3 deals in the last couple months. I just did a deal where a California investor bought a 28 unit. It was about a 28 unit. And they paid something in the neighborhood of $1.8 to $2 million. I ended up buying it from them because they couldn't manage it. And they didn't understand the St. Louis marketplace. I ended up buying it from $650,000. Wow. And the thing cash flows, and it cash flows ridiculously well. That's the kind of stuff that I go after. Is I look for asymmetric return. I look for opportunity that other people don't see. And so that the whole goal is to identify those unusual opportunities where there's a high upside and a low downside. And you can usually do that if you're not completely investing in the hood. I don't like to be in D grade areas. I like to be in the B minus C plus area. I don't mind taking some risk, but I'm really looking at what can I do with the knowledge in my head to make something worth a lot more money and make it operationally better. And most people screw up operations. And because I have a good construction background, I'm able to see things that other people can't see, how to fix things.
So explain that. Explain that comment you just made, that most people screw up operations.
Yeah, so it's easy to negotiate for a property. I mean, we're inherently, little kids are born as inherent negotiators unless we beat it out of them. Unless we completely just deject them. They're really good born negotiators, and so we have a negotiation skill that we're pretty good with. But the operations of how to do things is where the value is. I can negotiate like crazy. My mother was just an amazing negotiator. She taught me a ton. But it's the operational issues. When you look at a property and you ask yourself, what does this community need? And how am I going to get there? So I'll give you an example. Here I am. I've got this property on Broadway, and it's downtown St. Louis. It's in a rough area. And there's a lot of hookers there. There's a ton of hookers, and the hookers drive a ton of volume for themselves, but at the same time, they destroy the community. And so how do I get the hookers to leave my property and go to the park, go where it's somewhere else? And that way I don't have nefarious actors on my property. And so I tried everything. I tried contacting the police. I tried doing this. I tried the alderman. None of it worked. Basically, the police ignored me. The alderman said, I can't do anything about it. Or alderwoman said, I couldn't do anything about it. So what I did was I said, they're there because they're comfortable, and they're comfortable because of the lighting. There's not enough light. And just like anything, if you add a little bit more light, it's the Deming effect. If you add a little bit more light, people go, oh, somebody's paying attention to me. And so I added a ton of lighting, and I put motion detector lighting up around my building. So because my building occupies an entire city block. And so I put it up on the outside, and I put it up high enough that they can't throw rocks at it to turn it off. And then doing that, it eventually taught them that they shouldn't be hooking in front of my building. They can go a block away to the park where there's no light, and they can be okay there. And those kind of things. The previous owners had not figured out how to do that, and that's why they ended up selling it to me so cheaply, because they didn't innovate in that way. And there's a million other things to look at. There's what you're trying to do is you're trying to make silk purses out of sow's ears, and that's what real estate investors do. A good real estate investor can take the worst situation and make the best of it, and that's our job.
Yeah. Something happens when you get involved in real estate where if you are a long-term investor and you're in it for the long haul, it becomes part of your DNA. I think it gets in your blood. And I'm hearing from you how, you've been doing this since you were 16. And you mentioned a word that I think is really important, and that's consistency. Continually doing it over and over again and getting good at what you do. But it becomes part of who you are and your DNA. And I think that's reflective in the conversation with you. Are you syndicating any of your deals today, or are you doing everything on your own?
No, I syndicate and I do on my own. So I look at things as tiers. If it's close to me, if it's in my immediate hour and a half distance, and it's a high risk, I will not syndicate that. My feeling is I will never expose somebody else to the same risk or challenge that I would do myself, because it's not fair to them.
Are you ready to skyrocket your investment portfolio and leave a legacy? Are you tired of inconsistent returns received in the stock market? Do you think that it may be time you take a look at alternative investment options? Passive investing in multifamily real estate could just be that option for you. With no tenants, trash, or toilets to take care of, but providing a solid return on an annual basis that outperforms traditional investing, including monthly and quarterly returns along the way. These lower risk, secure assets are a sure hedge against inflation. If you want to learn more about these types of opportunities, you can email me directly for a 15-minute consultation to see if you qualify. Just email me at mike@mikemorawski.com.
They don't understand the risk characteristics of what I'm going to deal with. I know that if I lose money at it, or if I don't make as much as I should, it's my own damn problem. So I will not syndicate a deal like that. I'll only syndicate a deal that's B+ or better. And I really want to be very careful with other people's money, because I want to guarantee them a rate of return. And I know that you can't do that, but in my heart, I look at it going, I want them to have a great experience. Yeah. And so if it's a bigger project, and I'll co-syndicate, I'll syndicate. We've done all kinds of projects. I mean, I've worked with Neil Bawa, helped him and raised almost $100 million. Yeah. And we raised smaller amounts for other projects. So it really depends on the project. I've done small projects, a couple million, 4 or 5 million. I've done huge projects. But when I'm syndicating, I'm very, very particular what the characteristics are of that project, because my reputation's on the line, and I don't want anybody to have a bad experience. Yeah. And I'll go back to something that you mentioned, and I think it's really important, about constantly educating and constantly having consistency in what we do in multifamily. The reality is that multifamily is a vehicle. It's not an end in itself. Multifamily is a vehicle to achieve something greater. Mm-hmm. And we use this tool to do that. But recognize that you have to layer your tools. You cannot be a one-trick pony. And so if you do multifamily, how do you do multifamily? And then with the consistency, how do you educate yourself in a manner that you're constantly learning? And so there are some not troubling, but there's interesting things that are happening in multifamily that are worth looking at. I mean, certainly we have this interest rate shock, and what you're going to see, St. Louis, was number one in the cities where they expect multifamily to crash in the next 1 year. And because it's the highest default rate in the country with the lowest debt service coverage ratio. So if you overpaid and you were a California investor, you're going to have a problem, because 15% of all St. Louis real estate that's multifamily is going to crash in the next year. But if you don't overpay, then you have an amazing opportunity, because you're going to pick up assets that other people paid too much for, rehabbed above a certain level that they should have, and you'll be able to pick that up. So consistency in education is critical. You have to kind of predict what's going to happen next. And so certainly the interest rates is one factor. Certainly debt service coverage ratio is a factor. But other things is the effect of technology. We're going into an area, and I know that people talk about crypto, and I know that it's overhyped. I get it. I mean, we know that crypto is a Wild West phenomenon, but that's not the value of crypto. As a multifamily investor, the value of crypto is that you can have a Web3 enabled portal that somebody can pay you without you having to go to a connection on their bank. And they log into your portal and they say, hey, I need to pay my rent. And boom, there it is. And the cost of that transfer is zero. And there's an authentication and there's a handshake, and there's a validity. Well, you take that same data element and you connect it to all of the other property elements, and you have all of your bills there, and you have all of your reports, and you have all of this systemic stuff built. And you put that together as an entity, and you've created something that didn't exist. And so it's easier for you to get funding and lending later. And so you have to constantly sharpen your tools. You have to constantly look at all of the available technology and the emerging trends and see where it's going to go. One of the big things, like a simple example, when you have a lot of multifamily and you're trying to rent them, you have to be able to understand what the algorithms are for rental. And a simple thing, like if you're trying to list your property on Zillow for rent, you have to update that property almost daily in order to stay at the top of the list. Yep. And so you have to be able to automate that somehow, because you're not going to pay somebody $20 an hour to automate that, to do that for you a couple times a day. And you have to be able to write different verbiage for your advertisements. And hence that's where ChatGPT comes in, because you can take the same advertising and you can have it rephrase it in a way that makes it more compelling and select your keywords. So you have to constantly innovate in how you approach these things.
ChatGPT is an amazing tool right now.
It is.
And I think that the whole AI space is an amazing space because of what it's going to provide. And there is a sense of simplicity to some of that, like, hey, if I go, I wrote an ebook on multifamily investing off of ChatGPT. And in 2 hours, I wrote a 10-page ebook. And I said things like, okay, make this paragraph fun, tell a joke in here, do this, tell a story in here. And it was amazing what that tool provided. So, it's kind of cool where the world is going as a result of that. I'm glad you brought that up.
I think it's going to scare a lot of people that once they understand how effective it is. We're still dealing with a rudimentary AI. I mean, it's not really AI. It's more of a filtering mechanism with a predictive writer. And instead of predicting the next word, it's predicting the next paragraph, which is an interesting way to do it. It's not a true AI, but it's pretty good. And I love it. I think it's one of the coolest things ever.
Well, I mean, when you look at things like, so I was on the phone over the last couple of days talking to somebody, and I wish I could remember exactly. Oh, we were talking about some travel. and I needed to rent a car. And I hadn't done anything about going to rent a car yet. And all of a sudden, I'm getting all of these car rental emails now and hotel emails. And it's like, the predictability around, are they listening? Where's the information coming from? How are they picking that up? That whole space is just, it's almost kind of spooky sometimes.
It is. It's predicting based upon your behavior compared to other people's behavior of similar nature. But it also, there's a lot of information clues that we leave just in what we do. And so the big tech companies are able to aggregate that to build behavioral models that make it interesting for them to sell to you, because their job is to make money.
Yeah.
And so they're going to figure out a way to sell to you at your time of need.
Yeah. So two words come up in our conversation, this morning, and one is crisis, the other is risk. How do they inherently go together? Do they inherently go together for you? How do you mitigate those in your world?
Yeah, so that's why I use the term asymmetric return. Crisis usually is connotated with high risk. I'm looking for crisis situations where I can disconnect the risk of the substance. And so that usually occurs when you can take a longer view at something and you can say, okay, I'm in an immediate cataclysm right now, but long term, and long term might be 6 months or a year, I'm going to be okay. I'm going to suffer now for a longer term gain, recognizing that there's a high risk, but the asymmetrical reward is much greater. Most human beings live in the minute to minute, day to day. They're the stock market investor, and they're watching their Apple go up $4, and they're watching their Apple stock go down $2, and they think that that's the universe with which they're living. But there's something different about Apple, and because I know something about Apple. So what's different about Apple that makes me think, well, I don't care about the $2 or the $5 or the $3 or the 10 or the 20. Well, what's different is if you actually understand what they're doing. Apple is fundamentally an AI company. Most of their M1 and M2 chips, 60 to 90% of their computing power inside the M1 and M2 chip is basically AI. And what they're doing is they're aggregating data from you and they're analyzing it, and they're using very low energy to run that information. So there's an asymmetric return there. You're looking at an object that has one value, and it goes up and down, fluctuating on people's moods, but it has a asymmetric return because the technology is so amazing. It's the same thing as I'm going to invest in the hood, or I'm going to invest in this rural area, but I know that this other thing is going to happen. I'll give you the classic example. I bought a property in one of the worst areas in St. Louis, and you would think, Gurpreet, what are you doing? Why are you investing there? Well, what I had done is I had analyzed federal government statistics, and I had looked at centers for need for healthcare, and I had looked at federally qualified healthcare corporations, FQHCs, and they have to position them within certain narrow blocks. So based upon the block that they're supposed to be in, they get funding. And so I had looked at all of the funding opportunities. And so I had been targeting this, and I knew that there was some information being released on a Friday. I also know that inherently people that work in FQHCs are very lazy. So they're not going to read their email. So I saw the release on Friday at 5 p.m. I looked at it and I said, okay, well, within this 9 square block area, or this 3x3 area, this nine square blocks, they have to put an FQHC because that's what their funding is for. And they got a ton of money. Whoever does this has to do it in this 9 blocks. And so I went out and I drove the 9 blocks, and I identified every single building in that 9 blocks that could house an FQHC. I went out and I put every one of them, there were only 6. I put every one of them under an option contract to purchase that weekend. And by the time that the FQHCs figured out that they'd got the funding, which was the next week when they got around to it on Tuesday or Wednesday, all excited, telling the newspapers they got the funding, they went out and tried to find a building, and I had all of them under contract. And so then they had to negotiate with me, and I could set the price however I wanted. And I knew how much they were allowed to get because I'd read the contracts. So I knew exactly what they could afford to pay.
Huh.
And so I rehabbed it to what their needs were going to be. And I knew what they were going to pay me. And I did very well because I took a building that I got for $175,000 and instantaneously, based on cash flow, made it worth $800,000 in a matter of a month and a half. And so it's because I predicted, even though it's an asymmetrical return, even though it looks cataclysmic now, I know what the long term is going to be. And
So
isn't it risk?
Isn't it the same thing that we do when we build a exit plan on a property, or we build a CapEx plan, or we take a look at a property that's being run and not being run efficiently?
Exact
So,
same.
Operations, from management style. I can't tell you how many property managers or on-site leasing managers and leasing staff say, if the owner would just do this and this and this, and you can take those people and breathe new life into them and inject some capital into a property, you can turn those assets around relatively smoothly, and see those types of returns. It's similar
Exactly
to what you're talking about now.
Yeah, exactly the same. And so that's what you're doing. So if you already are controlling the property, or you're getting into a property that has that asymmetrical return, that's your highest yield, because you're not having to build an entirely new structure. You can take a sow's ear and turn it into a silk purse for not much money.
Yeah, I love that expression. Hey, let's talk about your book real quick. I know you co-author a book, Next Level. Some really great people, Dennis Waitley, and talk about that a little bit. And
yeah, so there's a book that came out. It's called Next Level Your Life. We released it about a week ago. We're in #1 category on Amazon. We're #1 in 31 categories, which is very unusual. It's a collection of vignettes and stories of people that are basically describing entrepreneurship and leadership styles, and describing how to deal with their life situations, how they dealt with them, and how it might be cross applicable. I think it's interesting because you get a lot of different perspectives. So Tom Ziegler's in there, Kyle Wilson, Simon Bailey, and Dennis Waitley, I think, did the foreword. And so there's a whole host of people. It's about 20 of us. Mm-hmm. And we've poured our information into that. And Kyle kind of weaved it together and brought it together. Each one of us is in our own chapters, and each one of us is in our own story, but he weaves it together so that it turns into something amazing. Yeah. It's done very well. And my book chapter is obviously about chaos. It's about dealing with chaotic situations and dealing with understanding what risk is, and having your head to the ground and your feelers out and your antenna up to understand what happens in a conflict situation. Yeah. And so that's kind of my take, but everybody else has a different take. And so when you weave it together, it's real interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. So I'm looking forward to getting my hands on a copy of that and reading it. So any tips or suggestions that you might give a new real estate investor today as they're maybe walking into some uncharted water with where the economy is, where the world's headed, all the doomsday experts out there? How would you tell somebody to, start looking at deals today and maybe not to sit on the sidelines, but to move forward?
So there's a couple things that we have to recognize. So if I'm predicting the future, we know that the U.S. is depopulating, but for immigration, we would be in net negative growth. Now, we have a lot of immigration. Some of it's legal, but most of it's not legal. But we have a lot of immigration, and that's the only reason why we haven't depopulated. Depopulation is the biggest risk that faces humanity in the foreseeable future. because every westernized country is depopulated. There will be only two countries that continue to grow. It'll be India and Nigeria for the foreseeable 2035 to 2055. China is depopulating rapidly. So as real estate investors, we are totally dependent upon population growth, because that's what drives appreciation in real estate. That's factor one. Factor two that drives appreciation in real estate is the destruction of our existing housing units. A lot of our housing units are older. Anything that's over 50 years old reaches functional obsolescence. And so it has to be essentially replaced between 50 to 75 years or so. So those are the two factors that are really driving this. And then obviously, what's your population growth in the area that you're investing? So those are the things I would keep my eyes out for. At the same time, I would also recognize that home ownership is becoming more and more challenging for people, and they're less and less likely to own their home, and they're less and less wanting to own their home because they want the flexibility of not owning. And in many areas, it's much more expensive to own than to lease, especially when you include the cost of maintenance and all those other factors. And the federal government and other folks think that it's perfectly fine for homeowners to lease and not own things. And so that's kind of where they're pushing it. So those people that will own and lease to the people that the federal government wants leased to will find that it's a tremendous advantage. It's just like taxes. Taxes are an incentive. So if you align yourself with the governmental incentive, you can do okay. As a new property investor, I would recognize those trends. I would recognize the demographic trend for the area that they're looking to invest, and then make a predictive analysis of what to do. So make the analysis, but then at the same time, do not be paralyzed in thinking, oh, I can wait a year or two.
Yeah.
No, the time to move on this stuff is when everybody else is panicked and walking away.
Yeah.
And that would be about now. That this is the time to set yourself up to not overeducate, but educate enough. You don't want to get into paralysis of overeducation, of overanalysis. It doesn't do you any good.
Yep.
And so you want to manage your risk. You don't want to take foolhardy risks, but you want to take advantage of the opportunities that are right here, right now. And they're coming. By the fall of this year, if I was a predictive kind of person, which I try to be, I would tell you that there's some amazing opportunity. You don't have to go out and buy a 100-unit multifamily. Start small if you have to.
Yeah.
I would, the simplest thing is buy a 4-unit. And you can buy it as a single family. Buy a 4-unit and house hack it. And it's a great opportunity to get your feet wet and still have a controlled situation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great advice. That's for sure. Well, listen, I appreciate you being here today. It's been, boy, you've got my head spinning. That's for sure. A lot of things to think about, and that I'm already thinking about on just how to look at deals and how to maybe even deliver information to potential investors and LPs that you're looking at bringing into your deals. How do people get a hold of you if they want to get a hold of you, Gurpreet?
The easiest way is redpillcapital with a K.com, info@redpillcapital.com, or just hit me up on LinkedIn. Those are really the easiest ways. I obviously have a medical site as well, but for most people that are in the multifamily world, they'll go through LinkedIn and reach out to me, or they'll go through our Red Pill Capital site. And that's usually the easiest way to reach out to me.
And I know you and I connected on LinkedIn originally, and I'm so grateful that we had the opportunity to do that. Hey, I'm going to move you to the back room. If you'd hang out with me for a minute, I'm going to just say goodbye, and we'll spend a few minutes together.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. Wow. What an over-the-top show this morning. If you hadn't had your coffee yet and started to listen in, you might want to go back and listen to this again. There were a lot of golden nuggets for sure in what Gurpreet talked about. And just looking at crisis, looking at risk, looking at operations, leadership, and, being consistent, right? Being consistent in what we do. So if you're a multifamily investor, if you're a real estate investor, you're involved in the space, keep taking action. And I couldn't agree with him more today that we are moving into an environment that, hey, some of us will only see this one more time in our lifetime. Some of us might only see this time, or this might be the first time in your lifetime you're going to see this space that we're going into. But I believe that this environment is going to be the best environment for buying and repositioning multifamily and taking advantage of the growth. They say this is where most millionaires get created, is when the environment gets like this. Thanks for being here. We're here every Saturday morning. Please subscribe to the channel so you're notified when we're going live. Subscribe to YouTube, like us, love us on all the other social media. I'm glad that you're here. If you have questions, need anything, don't hesitate to reach